The border villages of western Poland are still dark. It is Friday, the 1st of September 1939, and the hour is 4:45 in the morning. In the fields outside Wielun, a small textile town of no strategic weight whatsoever, the harvest is nearly in. Sheaves lean against one another in the stubble. A dog barks somewhere near the church. In the henhouses along the lanes, roosters have begun their ordinary work, calling up a sun that has not yet risen. There is dew on the rye. There is smoke from a single chimney where a baker has already begun his morning. In every direction, from the Baltic coast down through Pomerania and Silesia, and across the Slovak passes to the south, a country of 35 million people is asleep, or turning over in its beds, or lacing its boots for a day of work that will not come. At that moment, the first Junkers Ju-87 Stukas are already in the air. They come in low over the fields with their spatted undercarriages hanging like the talons of some prehistoric bird, engines pitched into that thin, unmistakable wail the Germans have engineered into their sirens for exactly this purpose, to break the nerve before it breaks the body. There is no declaration of war. There has been no ultimatum. There is no radio warning, because the Polish command has received no warning to broadcast. The bombs fall on the hospital first, then on the market square, then on the houses along the road out of town, houses whose occupants will never know what military purpose they were thought to serve, because they served none. Wielun has no garrison. Wielun has no factories of any consequence. Wielun is simply in the way, and it is a convenient place for the Luftwaffe to calibrate what the doctrine calls, in the flat, cold German of the operations manuals, terror from above. 70 kilometres to the north, at almost precisely the same minute, the old battleship Schleswig-Holstein, anchored in Danzig harbour, on what had been billed to the Polish authorities as a courtesy visit, opens its main guns on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. The shells are 11-inch. They arrive from a range of a few hundred metres. The concussion breaks every window in the old town. Polish soldiers on the peninsula, roughly 200 of them, wake to find themselves already at war and already surrounded. To the west, in a broad arc that stretches from East Prussia in the north, down through Pomerania, across the Silesian frontier, and around into occupied Czechoslovakia in the south, roughly 1.5 million German soldiers step across the border. 2,500 tanks, Panzers in twos, the heavier threes and Vs in smaller numbers, their crews buttoned up, their radios live, grind forward through the border villages and into the Polish plain. 2,000 aircraft take to the air behind them. The operation has a name, though almost no one on the receiving end will hear it for weeks. Full Weiss, case white. In Warsaw, 300 kilometres to the east, the rail hub is bombed before the first written order has reached the Polish General Staff. This is what it means, in the most literal and physical sense possible, to be surprised. Consider what surprise costs a nation second by second in the first minutes of a war. A Polish cavalry brigade in the border region is billeted in a village whose name the German staff officers have circled on a map the previous evening. The horses are in the picket lines. The men are asleep in barns and requisitioned houses. The officers have not yet been handed the morning's dispatches, because the couriers who would have carried them are themselves still asleep. The regimental radio is off. When the Stukas come, the brigade does not fight. It disperses, and dispersal at 4 in the morning. Under aerial bombardment is not a manoeuvre. It is a scattering. Horses bolt. Men run for tree lines. By the time the officers have gathered what fraction of their command they can find, half the day is gone, and they are no longer a formation. They are refugees with rifles. Multiply that by dozens of frontier units. Multiply it by every rail junction the Luftwaffe has mapped and struck in the first hour. Multiply it by every telephone exchange whose wires have been cut by German sabotage teams in civilian clothes. Teams that crossed the border in the days before the attack and have been waiting, patient as spiders, for the appointed hour. Multiply it by the fact that the Polish mobilization order, the full one, not the partial call-up already underway, has not yet been given, because the Polish government, under enormous diplomatic pressure from London and Paris, to avoid the appearance of provocation, has held it back. The failure here is not one of courage. It is not one of doctrine exactly, though Polish doctrine has its own problems. It is a failure of information. The Polish General Staff does not know, at 4:45 that morning, where the German army is. It does not know the axes of advance. It does not know the depth of the penetrations. It does not know whether the northern thrust from East Prussia is the main effort, or the southern thrust out of Slovakia, or whether both are diversions, and the true blow is coming through the corridor. It does not know these things because there is no way for it to know them. There are no satellites, there are no drones, there is no persistent, wide-area, real-time picture of the battlefield. There is a handful of PZLP-11 fighters, obsolete already at the moment of their manufacture, whose pilots, brave to a fault, will scramble into the morning sky to find the Luftwaffe already above them, faster, higher, more numerous, and coordinated by radio in ways the Polish Air Force has not yet fully mastered. The Polish soldier on the ground that morning is fighting blind. The Polish officer at the divisional command post is fighting blind. The Polish general at the operations map in Warsaw is fighting blind. And the German war machine, which has spent the summer perfecting exactly this, the collapse of an enemy's ability to see, is executing its doctrine to the letter. That is the picture. Hold it in the mind. The roosters still crowing in the border villages, the Stukas already over the rooftops, the 11-inch shells falling on Westerplatte, the phone lines cut, the cavalry scattering, and in Warsaw, at the great terminus where the rails from Krakow and Poznan and Lwów meet, the roof of the station coming down in fire and dust before the general staff has finished its first cup of coffee. That is what a blitzkrieg looks like when it works. And it works, in September 1939, because of one thing above all others. Not the tanks, not the aircraft, not the doctrine of combined arms, though all of these matter. It works because the Polish command cannot see what is coming until it has already arrived. Strip that away, put eyes over the border, put ears in the ionosphere, put a picture of every panzer division on a desk in Warsaw 6 hours before the first shot, and the whole edifice trembles. The question that will drive the next 2 hours is exactly that. What is a blitzkrieg without a blind target? To answer it, one has first to understand the machine itself, how it was built, what load-bearing elements held it up, and where precisely its weight rested. Blitzkrieg has been mythologized so thoroughly in the 8 decades since 1939 that it is now nearly impossible to see it clearly. The word conjures tanks, and yes, there were tanks. It conjures dive bombers, and yes, there were dive bombers. It conjures a certain Wagnerian aesthetic of speed and steel, of arrows on maps sweeping across nations in coloured ink, of the newsreel narrator's voice rising over the drone of Stuka engines. All of that is real, none of it is the engine. The engine is something quieter, and it lives at the intersection of doctrine and information. The German army that crossed into Poland at 4:45 on the 1st of September was not, on paper, overwhelmingly larger than the force it faced. The Polish army could put roughly 1 million men into the field once fully mobilised. The Germans deployed roughly 1.5 million in the initial assault, with more in reserve. The disparity in tanks was real but not absurd. Poland fielded several hundred light tanks and tankettes of her own, and in the correct hands they were not useless. The disparity in aircraft was greater, and the disparity in quality, the Bf-109 against the P-11, was severe. But history is full of campaigns in which the smaller or worse-equipped side has held, has bled its attacker white, has traded space for time until the strategic picture shifted. What made 1939 different is that Poland did not get the chance. The German doctrine of the late 1930s, the doctrine we now call Blitzkrieg, though the Wehrmacht itself preferred the older word Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, was designed with a single, ruthless objective. It was not to destroy the enemy army, it was to collapse the enemy's command and control before the enemy army could be brought to bear as a coherent instrument. The distinction is not academic. An army whose divisions are intact but whose staff cannot direct them, whose signals cannot reach them, whose reserves cannot be moved to the point of crisis in time to matter, is not an army. It is a collection of formations, each fighting its own private war, each ignorant of what its neighbours are doing, each vulnerable to being cut off, encircled and reduced piece by piece. This is what the Wehrmacht did to Poland in September 1939. The panzer divisions did not seek out the strongest Polish formations to smash them. They sought out the seams between formations, the open roads, the undefended headquarters, the rail junctions, the telegraph offices. They drove for the joints, not for the muscles. Behind them came the motorised infantry to hold the ground the tanks had passed through. Above them flew the Luftwaffe, tasked not primarily with strategic bombing of factories or cities, but with tactical strikes on the very things a modern army needs to think with. Command posts, communications hubs, marshalling yards, columns of reinforcements moving up the roads toward a front that was already, in operational terms, behind them. Speed was the medium, surprise was the multiplier. Together they produced a tempo of operations that the Polish command, working with maps and telephones and horseborne couriers, simply could not match. By the time a Polish division received orders to move to a threatened sector, the sector had already been overrun. By the time reinforcements arrived on a road, the road had already been cut. By the time the general staff formed a coherent picture of what was happening, the picture was no longer accurate. The Germans had moved again. Take away either of those two multipliers, speed or surprise, and Blitzkrieg reverts to something the German High Command knew all too well from the trenches of the previous war. It reverts to attritional grinding. If the Polish command had known, on the 25th of August, where every panzer division was concentrated and where every airfield was massed, if it had known the axes of advance and the timing of the strike, if it had been able to disperse its own aircraft, harden its own command posts, blow its own bridges on a schedule of its own choosing, and mobilize its reserves a week early, then the Germans would still have attacked, and they would still likely have won, but they would not have won in 35 days. They would have won in 6 months, or 9, or a year, at a cost measured in hundreds of thousands of dead, rather than the tens of thousands the historical campaign actually claimed on the German side. And in 6 months, or 9, or a year, the strategic situation of Europe would have been an entirely different thing. This is why it is fair, indeed necessary, to describe Blitzkrieg as an information warfare tactic dressed in tank steel. The steel matters. The steel is the delivery mechanism, but the payload is informational. What the German army delivered to Poland in the first week of September 1939 was blindness, deafness, and paralysis inflicted at a speed that outran the Polish nervous system. Everything else, the tanks, the dive bombers, the encirclements at the Bzura and around Warsaw, was the working out of the consequences of that initial informational collapse. Which brings the story, inevitably, to the men on the other side of the wire, to the intelligence officers of Britain and France, and to the Polish military attachés in Berlin, and to the diplomats in Warsaw and London and Paris, and to the question of what, in the last weeks of peace, the Allies actually knew. The answer, in short, is less than they thought, and far less than they needed. Consider the tools available to an Allied intelligence officer in August 1939. Aerial reconnaissance existed, but it was limited in almost every dimension that matters. The aircraft was slow. The fastest reconnaissance platforms of the late 1930s cruised at speeds a modern light aircraft would recognise, and their range was short. A reconnaissance flight out of eastern France could photograph the German border regions and, at some risk, penetrate a little further. It could not overfly Berlin. It could not persistently monitor the training grounds in East Prussia, where panzer divisions were rehearsing their assembly. It could not sit above a rail junction for hours, watching trainloads of ammunition move east. A reconnaissance flight was an event, a single aircraft, on a single mission, on a single day, weather permitting, bringing back a single roll of film to be developed and interpreted in a dark room over the following days. By the time the interpreters had drawn their conclusions, the situation on the ground had moved. Signals intelligence existed too, but it was in its institutional infancy. The Polish Cryptological Service, the extraordinary team of Radzewski, Zagalski and Ruzicki, had in fact achieved one of the greatest intelligence coups of the 20th century by beginning to break the German Enigma cipher in the early 1930s, and had, in the last weeks of peace, shared this triumph with British and French counterparts. That gift would echo through the war in ways that saved uncounted lives. But in August and early September 1939, the operational take from Enigma decryption was thin. The machinery of Bletchley Park was not yet built. The industrial-scale code-breaking that would later shorten the war was months and years away. What flowed to Allied commanders in the last week of peace was fragmentary, ambiguous, and hedged. And then there was the diplomatic noise. The German government spent the summer of 1939 producing a fog of statements, ultimatums, negotiations, retracted concessions, staged incidents, and calculated leaks designed to keep the Allied and Polish governments off balance. There was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact sprung on the world in late August, which rearranged the strategic map overnight and left London and Paris scrambling to reassess. There were the reports of concentrations in East Prussia, cross-cut by reports of possible German withdrawals elsewhere. There was the staged incident at the Gleiwitz radio station, on the night of the 31st of August, SS men in Polish uniforms, a corpse dressed as a Polish soldier, designed to give Berlin the fig leaf of a provocation to answer. In this environment, an Allied intelligence officer trying to assemble a picture of the German order of battle was working with fragments. A photograph here, a defector's report there, a diplomatic cable, a wireless intercept, an attaché's estimate of the crowd at a Berlin railway station. He was working essentially with what the historian A.J.P. Taylor would have called the human eye at ground level, augmented only lightly by the human eye at 10,000 feet. He was not working with anything a modern intelligence officer would recognize as a picture at all. The scale of the leap that would separate that officer from his successors is difficult to overstate, and it is worth pausing on, because it is the leap that makes this entire thought experiment possible. Consider the Corona program. Corona was the first American photo reconnaissance satellite constellation, developed under conditions of extraordinary secrecy in the late 1950s and operational, after a long string of failures, from the early 1960s onward. Its cameras were film-based. The exposed film was returned to Earth in re-entry capsules snatched from the sky over the Pacific by specially modified aircraft. By modern standards, Corona was primitive. The resolution of its earliest imagery was measured in meters rather than centimeters. Its coverage of any particular target was episodic, and yet, and this is the fact that ought to stop the modern listener in his tracks, a single successful Corona mission over the Soviet Union produced more photographic intelligence than every U-2 spy plane flight that had preceded it, combined. Every U-2 flight combined, every deep penetration overflight of the Soviet Union in the late 1950s, every risky sortie over Sverdlovsk and beyond, every roll of film that Francis Gary Powers and his colleagues had brought back, the whole heroic, expensive, politically explosive apparatus of manned strategic reconnaissance in the pre-satellite era, was surpassed, in a single afternoon's take, by one satellite pass. That is the leap from the human eye at 10,000 feet to the human eye at 150 miles. And that leap happened in about 20 years, from the late 1930s to the early 1960s. In the 6 decades since, the leap has continued, and it has accelerated and it has multiplied across dozens of new modalities that Corona's designers could scarcely have imagined. Digital sensors, real-time downlink, synthetic aperture radar that can see through cloud and darkness, infrared imaging that can distinguish a running truck engine from a cold one, multispectral analysis that can tell disturbed Earth from undisturbed, persistent constellations that keep a target under continuous watch rather than passing over it once a day, cross-cued sensors that hand off automatically from one platform to another as a target of interest moves. The intelligence officer of 1939 stared at a grainy print of a railway siding and tried to guess whether the boxcars in it were full or empty. The intelligence officer of the present day sits in front of a screen on which the boxcars are labelled, tracked, time-stamped, and cross-referenced against every previous appearance of every one of them for the past 6 months. All of it updated in something close to real time, all of it fed by systems whose existence and general capabilities are matters of public record even when their specific outputs are not. Between those two officers lies a gulf so wide that the language of degree, better, sharper, faster, is inadequate to describe it. It is a difference of kind, and this gulf is the reason the thought experiment that will occupy the remainder of this story is worth taking seriously. Because the doctrine of Blitzkrieg, as executed against Poland in September 1939, was a doctrine calibrated for the intelligence environment of that earlier officer. It was designed to defeat him. It was designed to move faster than his cameras, to strike before his interpreters could develop their film, to arrive at his headquarters before his couriers had finished their morning coffee. Against him, it worked, and it worked spectacularly. Against his successor, sitting today in the operations floor of a modern combatant command, watching a screen fed by NATO's alliance persistent surveillance from space, by the National Reconnaissance Office's classified constellations, by the space-based infrared system's thermal watch, by every Allied sensor across every relevant modality. Against him, it is a different question entirely. It is not obvious that it works at all. It is not obvious that the tanks even reach the border before the world knows they are coming. It is not obvious that surprise, in the sense Halder and Guderian and the German General Staff understood the word, is available as a resource at all. That is the pivot this story will make. Not yet, the ground of 1939 is not yet fully covered, and the campaign that unfolded across those 35 days between the 1st of September and the surrender of Warsaw on the 27th has its own lessons still to yield, lessons that will be needed when the clock is reset. But the pivot is visible from here. The intelligence gap that made Fall Weiss possible is a gap that no longer exists. The doctrine that exploited that gap has been left in one crucial sense, without an opponent to exploit. Return for a moment to the villages along the Polish border on that first morning. The Stukas have come and gone. The smoke is rising from Wielun, the shells are still falling on Westerplatte, the panzer columns are already 20 kilometres deep in places the Polish command does not yet know they have reached. In Warsaw, the phones are ringing at the General Staff and the reports coming in are contradictory and fragmentary, and already out of date by the time they are written down. The Polish Air Force is scrambling into a sky the Luftwaffe already owns. The cavalry brigades are reforming or trying to in the woodlots behind the villages the Germans have already passed. The country is at war, and it has been at war for perhaps 2 hours, and its government has not yet been able to answer the most basic question a government at war must answer. What, in fact, is happening? That is the sensation to hold. Not the tanks, not the dive bombers, the silence on the telephone line, the blank space on the map, the couriers who do not come back, the reconnaissance flight that finds nothing because it is looking in the wrong place. The staff officer at 4 in the morning trying to make a decision with information that is already 6 hours stale. That is the blindness on which the whole Blitzkrieg rested. Understand its completeness in 1939, and one has begun to understand why its absence, in any modern replay, would change everything that followed. The Allies, in their capitals to the west, did not yet know the half of it. In London, in Paris, the news of the invasion was arriving in the form of frantic cables from the Polish ambassador, and confused reports from press stringers who had themselves fled the bombing. In the Foreign Office, in the Quai d'Orsay, officials were assembling for emergency meetings whose agendas had not yet been drafted. The great question, what would Britain and France do, and when, and how, was still open, and it would remain open in practical military terms for months. But before turning to what the Allies did, and did not, do in the days that followed, the story must sit a little longer with what they had failed to see, because it is that failure of sight, not of will, not of courage, not of alliance, that is the true subject of everything that comes next. The failure of sight in September 1939 was not corrected by the events that followed, it was compounded. In the first 48 hours of the invasion, the Luftwaffe conducted what remains one of the most systematic air campaigns against a national air force ever executed. Polish airfields, whose locations had been mapped by German intelligence over the preceding months through a combination of overflights, agents and open-source aviation records, were struck in coordinated waves. Runways were cratered, hangars were burned, fuel dumps were touched off, aircraft that had been dispersed to secondary fields, a precaution the Polish command had ordered in the last days of August, and one of the few operational decisions of that week that would later be judged wise, were hunted down through the following mornings as reconnaissance flights identified the dispersal patterns. The PZL P-11 fighters, gull-winged and open-cockpitted, obsolete before the war had even begun, took off into skies that were no longer contested but occupied. Their pilots fought with a courage that has been documented in the records of every squadron. It was not enough. By the end of the second day, the Polish Air Force as an organised instrument of war had ceased to function. Individual aircraft continued to fly, individual pilots continued to score kills, but the coordinated defence of Polish airspace was over, and with it went the last hope that ground formations moving in daylight could do so under any kind of protective cover. What that meant on the ground can be described, and it can be counted, but neither the description nor the count fully carries the weight of it. The columns of civilians moving east along every road that led away from the fighting were strafed by aircraft whose pilots had orders to attack traffic without discrimination. Refugee movement was itself a strategic target, because refugee movement clogged the roads that Polish military units needed to use for redeployment. That the people on those roads were unarmed and often barefoot, and often children, was not a factor in the operational calculus. The Stuka pilots came in low. The machine gunners in the He-1 worked the ditches on either side of the roadway. The bodies that had to be pushed aside by the columns behind were counted in some places by parish priests, and in other places not counted at all. In the towns, the pattern that had been established at Wielun on the first morning was repeated. Undefended settlements with no military value were bombed as a matter of doctrine, on the theory that the collapse of civil order behind the front would accelerate the collapse of resistance at the front. Frampol, a small town in the Lublin region built on a geometric grid that made it, from the air, a nearly perfect target for practice bombing, was struck in a manner that has been interpreted by historians as precisely that. A live-fire exercise conducted against a population that had no anti-aircraft defence and no strategic significance. Whether that interpretation is correct in every detail is debated. What is not debated is that the town was destroyed and its people were killed, and the operation served no military purpose that could be defended in any post-war accounting. The panzer columns pushed east faster than the Polish command's own maps could track them. By the fourth day of the war, German armoured spearheads were already deep into positions that Polish operational planning had assumed could not be reached for weeks. The strategic reserve, such as it was committed piecemeal into gaps that had already been overrun by the time the orders to commit arrived. Polish counterattacks, and there were counterattacks, several of them tactically well conducted, struck into flanks that had already thickened with follow-on infantry. The Battle of the Bzura, which began in the second week of September and became the largest engagement of the campaign, was fought by Polish formations that had marched hard to reach a decisive point, only to discover that the decisive point had moved. They fought well, they inflicted losses, they were enveloped and destroyed, and then, on the 17th of September, the eastern border opened. The Red Army crossed into Poland along a front that stretched from the Baltic marshes down to the Carpathian foothills. The secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, whose existence had been suspected by Western intelligence services, but whose specific provisions had not been established, was executed in the open. Polish forces along the eastern border, whose thinly held positions had been kept thin precisely because the eastern flank was assumed to be, if not friendly, at least neutral, were overrun within hours. The Polish government, which had already relocated from Warsaw to the town of Kuti near the Romanian border, now found itself with no direction of retreat that did not lead into internment. On the night of the 17th and the morning of the 18th, the President, the Prime Minister, the Commander-in-Chief, and the diplomatic corps crossed the Romanian frontier. They were interned by the Romanian authorities under German diplomatic pressure. The government of Poland, as an entity operating on Polish soil, ceased to exist. Warsaw held longer than the arithmetic of forces suggested it should have. The garrison, reinforced by units that had fought their way back from the frontier, dug in around the old city and the western suburbs and fought under conditions that grew steadily worse as the encirclement tightened. The Luftwaffe bombed the city day and night. Artillery ranged in on the waterworks and the power stations. Fires burned in the residential districts that the fire brigade itself under bombardment could not reach. Food ran short, then very short. The mayor, Stefan Starzyński, broadcast to the city over a radio station whose transmitter was hit and repaired and hit again, his voice becoming steadily hoarser and steadily more determined as the days passed. He would be arrested by the Gestapo after the surrender and would not survive the war. The city capitulated on the 27th of September. Formal surrender documents were signed the following day. Modlin, the fortress complex north of the capital, held out until the 29th. The last organised Polish resistance in the field, at Kock, ended on the 6th of October. 35 days had passed since the Stukas had crossed the border at dawn on the 1st. The human arithmetic of those 35 days is difficult to state cleanly, because the categories bleed into one another, and because the counting continued long after the fighting ended. Approximately 66,000 Polish soldiers were killed in action. Something on the order of 130,000 were wounded. Nearly 700,000 were taken prisoner by the Germans. Something over 200,000 more were taken prisoner by the Soviets. Of the Soviet prisoners, a portion, including the officer corps interned at camps whose names would later become notorious, would be executed by the NKVD in the spring of 1940 at Katyn and adjacent sites. Civilian deaths during the September campaign itself are estimated in the range of 150,000 to 200,000, a figure that does not attempt to encompass what would follow under the two occupation regimes that now partition the country. That larger accounting of the ghettos, of the death camps, of the Warsaw Uprising, of the systematic destruction of the Polish intelligentsia by both occupiers belongs to a different chapter of the war. But its beginning is here, in these 35 days, and any thought experiment that displaces this campaign into a different time must reckon with the fact that what was being lost in September 1939 was not a strategic position on a map, but a nation, and the people in it, and the possibility of their ordinary lives. The government in exile reconstituted itself in Paris in the following weeks, then moved to Angers, then, after the fall of France in the summer of 1940, to London. It would remain in London for the duration of the war and, in a diminished but continuous form, for decades after. Polish soldiers who had escaped through Romania and Hungary would fight at Narvik, in the Battle of Britain, at Tobruk, at Monte Cassino, in the Normandy campaign, and across the long road to the Rhine. The Polish contribution to the Allied war effort would be, by any reasonable measure, disproportionate to the country's pre-war population and grotesquely disproportionate to the recognition it would receive at Yalta and Potsdam. But that too belongs to a later reckoning. The point to hold before moving forward is the speed, 35 days, from a border crossing at 4:45 in the morning to a formal surrender of the capital on the 27th, and organised resistance ended by the 6th of October. A modern European state with an army of roughly 1 million once mobilised, with a functioning air force, with fortified positions along parts of its western frontier, with an alliance treaty with the world's largest colonial empire and its principal continental partner, 35 days from invasion to disintegration. That number is the reason the case is worth reopening. Whatever the surveillance environment of the present day does or does not do to the Blitzkrieg, whatever the alliance structure of the present day does or does not do to the calculus of intervention, the outcome that must be measured against is a country destroyed in 5 weeks. The stakes of the thought experiment are set by that number, and now the Allies. Britain and France had, on the 3rd of September, given Germany an ultimatum and, when the ultimatum expired without response, declared war. The declarations were serious. The consequences would ultimately be serious. But in the immediate operational sense, in the sense that mattered to a Polish infantryman being pushed back through a burning village in Silesia on the 3rd of September, the declarations produced almost nothing. There was no Allied offensive in the West. There was no strategic bombing of German industry. There was no naval action of any consequence beyond the standing blockade. There was, in the phrase that would attach itself to the following 8 months, a phony war. The reasons for the inaction were not secret and were not, in the analysis of the participants themselves, dishonourable. The French army, the largest land force in Western Europe, was configured for a defensive campaign. Its doctrine, shaped by the memory of the Great War and by 20 years of political and budgetary decisions, assumed that any war with Germany would be fought from behind the Maginot Line, and that offensive operations into German territory would be conducted only after full mobilisation and only in coordination with a British expeditionary force that would take months to arrive at full strength. The French High Command, examining its own war plans in the first week of September, concluded that no significant offensive could be mounted against the Siegfried Line before the following spring at the earliest. A limited advance into the Saarland was conducted in the second week of September, penetrating a few kilometres into territory the Germans had left thinly held. It reached its high water mark and was quietly withdrawn. The British position was, if anything, more constrained. The British Expeditionary Force in September 1939 consisted of 4 divisions, deploying across the Channel in stages that would not be complete until October. The Royal Air Force, tasked with the strategic bombing of Germany, was authorised to attack only naval targets, and, for the remainder of the year, to drop leaflets over German cities rather than bombs, on the theory that a bombing campaign directed at industrial targets would inevitably kill civilians and would justify German reprisals against British ones. Whether that theory was correct, whether restraint in September would have prevented anything in the years that followed, is a question historians continue to argue. What is not in dispute is that in the crucial weeks when Poland was being overrun, the Royal Air Force did not bomb Germany. There was also, threaded through all of this, a political calculation that no one wanted to state aloud, but that shaped every decision. Neither Chamberlain nor Daladier had wanted war in September 1939. Both had spent the preceding year attempting to avoid it. Both had, in their private communications and in the postures of their governments, entertained the possibility that even after the declarations of war, some negotiated settlement might yet be found, that Hitler, having taken what he wanted in Poland, might yet be persuaded to stop. That hope, in retrospect, appears grotesque. In the first week of September 1939, it was, for men in their positions, not unreasonable to hold. It was, at any rate, not a hope that lent itself to vigorous prosecution of the war they had just declared. And so the Polish ambassador in London and the Polish ambassador in Paris spent the September days making increasingly desperate representations to foreign ministries that received them with sympathy and courtesy and offered, in operational terms, nothing. The Anglo-Polish military alliance signed on the 25th of August 1939, a document whose ink was scarcely dry when the invasion began, contained mutual assistance provisions that the Polish government had understood to imply immediate military action in the event of German aggression. The British government interpreted the same provisions to imply a declaration of war and the eventual, staged, methodical prosecution of that war on a timetable set by British military readiness. Both interpretations were, in their way, defensible readings of the text. Only one of them was of any use to Poland. This is the honest caveat that must be entered into the record before the pivot is made. Formal alliances do not automatically produce military intervention. Treaty obligations do not automatically produce troop deployments. The gap between a signed document and a moving column of tanks is filled by political will, by logistical capacity, by domestic opinion, by the private calculations of statesmen who must weigh what they can do against what they think they can afford. In 1939, that gap was 8 months long on the Western Front, and in operational terms it was longer than that, because when the German offensive in the West finally came in May of 1940, the Allied forces that met it were still incompletely prepared, still doctrinally misaligned, still fighting the last war rather than the current one. The phony war was not, as it has sometimes been described, a period of nothing happening. It was a period in which two great powers, having declared war on a third, discovered how difficult it was to translate that declaration into anything that might have altered the fate of the country on whose behalf they had, in principle, gone to war. This lesson matters because it constrains what any thought experiment about the present can honestly claim. It is tempting, when contemplating a modern replay of 1939, to imagine that the machinery of collective defence, the North Atlantic Treaty, the integrated command structures, the forward deployed forces, the annual exercises, would produce, in the moment of crisis, an immediate and overwhelming military response. It is tempting to imagine a NATO cavalry charge, but the historical record from 1939 and from every subsequent crisis in which alliance mechanisms have been tested does not support that imagination. Alliances produce consultations, consultations produce deliberations, deliberations produce, eventually, decisions. The tempo of that process is not the tempo of a panzer division moving through a defended frontier. It never has been. It is not honest to pretend that it now would be. That caveat established, the thought experiment can be scoped. And it must be scoped carefully, because a thought experiment that tries to do too much becomes indistinguishable from speculation, and speculation, at the resolution required to answer questions about war, becomes indistinguishable from invention. What follows is not an attempt to game out a full modern war on the eastern flank of the Atlantic Alliance. That war, if it were ever fought, would depend on 10,000 variables that no one outside the general staffs of the powers involved can even enumerate, and half of those variables would depend on decisions made in the first hours of the crisis by human beings whose reactions cannot be modelled from outside. Any narrative that pretended to describe such a war in operational detail would be doing something other than history and something other than analysis. It would be fiction. What can be done, honestly, is something narrower and more useful. The Blitzkrieg of 1939 rested on a specific mechanism: total surprise. That mechanism can be examined in isolation. It can be asked of the surveillance environment that actually exists in the present day whether that mechanism could still function, not whether an invasion would succeed, not whether it would be resisted, and by whom, and with what result. Only this: Could the specific tactical resource on which full Weiss depended, the Polish command's total blindness to the concentration and movement of the German army that was about to attack it, still be produced under modern conditions? Could a comparable modern armoured force mass at a modern Polish border at dusk, with first light as the intended H-hour, and reach that H-hour with the defender and the defender's allies, still not knowing what was about to happen? That question is answerable. It has a factual foundation in real satellite constellations that are known to be in orbit, in real sensor systems that are known to be operational, in real historical incidents in which those systems have been tested against real threats and whose outcomes are on the public record. The answer will not resolve the larger question of what a modern war on that frontier would look like, but it will resolve, with a reasonable degree of confidence, the question of whether the specific catastrophic advantage that Germany enjoyed in September 1939, the advantage of moving unseen, is available to any comparable attacker today. And that resolution is worth having, because the entire moral and strategic weight of the 1939 campaign hangs on that advantage. Strip it away, and the campaign that unfolded does not unfold the same way. Perhaps it does not unfold at all. Perhaps it unfolds worse, in ways that a modern arsenal makes possible. But it does not unfold the same. So the rules of the thought experiment are these. The pivot will be declared, not slid into. It will hold constant the political configuration that the modern date implies. Poland as a NATO member since 1999, forward-deployed multinational battalions already on Polish soil, an alliance treaty structure that has been repeatedly tested and repeatedly shown to prioritise consultation over reflexive military action. It will not assume an automatic Article 5 response, because the record does not support that assumption. It will note where the alliance has actually invoked Article 4 in preference to Article 5 within the last several years, and it will treat the resulting ambiguity as part of the scenario rather than as something to be wished away. It will hold the attacker's technology to a level roughly comparable to a modern peer or near-peer power, the sort of force that could plausibly mass mechanized formations near the Polish frontier. And it will focus its attention narrowly on the question of surprise, what the defenders would see when they would see it, and what the visibility of the attack would do to the calculations of the attackers themselves. There are limits that must be acknowledged inside those rules. The United States Missile Defense Review of 2022, in a passage that has been quoted often, and should be quoted here for the record, states that the American ground-based mid-course defense system is neither intended nor capable of defeating full-scale ballistic missile arsenals from peer powers such as Russia or China. That sentence is in the review as a matter of doctrine, and it means what it says. The thought experiment cannot pretend that American missile defense provides a comprehensive shield against a determined nuclear-armed adversary. It does not. It provides certain capabilities against certain classes of threat under certain conditions, and those capabilities have been demonstrated in combat, and they matter, and they will be described in their proper place. But they are not a magic wand. The 2022 review, an official document of the government whose systems are under discussion, is explicit on this point, and any honest analysis must be explicit with it. There is a further limit, which is that the surveillance environment of the present day is not omniscient. Satellites have orbital periods, weather obscures optical imagery, adversaries invest in camouflage and deception, and the exploitation of gaps in coverage. The claim that will be made is not that a modern invasion would be seen with perfect clarity from the first movement to the last. The claim will be more specific, that the scale of the mobilization required to move an army group into attack positions is too large and too physically distinctive to be hidden from the sensor suite that the United States and its allies currently operate, and that the warning time provided by that sensor suite would be measured in weeks for the general build-up and in hours for the final crossing, not in the minutes that a defender at 4:45 in the morning on September 1st, 1939 had available. Within those rules and those limits, the question can be pursued. It has a shape. It has in real programs and real incidents and real budgetary line items and real satellite launches an evidentiary base. The Alliance Persistent Surveillance from Space program, known within NATO as Aquila, has been operational since 2023, with more than $1 billion committed by 17 allied nations including the United States, and its stated mission is precisely the tracking of military mobilizations and asset movements in near real time. The National Reconnaissance Office operates a classified constellation of imaging satellites whose capabilities are, by any assessment that has been made publicly, the most advanced in the world. The office's own historical materials note that its predecessor program of the 1960s, Corona, produced within a single decade more photographic intelligence than every U-2 flight before it combined, and the trajectory of capability since then has not flattened. The space-based infrared system, SBIRS, watches for the thermal signatures of ballistic missile launches and identifies them within seconds of ignition. The Aegis Ballistic Missile Defense System, deployed aboard Ticonderoga-class cruisers and Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, has demonstrated in the actual combat conditions of April 2024 over the Persian Gulf the capability to intercept ballistic missiles fired in anger by a state adversary. These are not hypotheticals. They are lines in defense budgets and hulls in the water and satellites in orbit and, in the case of the April 2024 intercepts, kills on the record. Against those systems, the question of whether the mechanism of 1939 still functions has a real answer. That answer will require a walk through what each of those systems actually does, and what a modern mobilization looks like to their sensors, and what the warning products of that mobilization would look like on the desks of the people who receive them. It will require an honest reckoning with what the alliance structure would and would not do with such warning once it arrived, and it will require, at the end, a return to the roads of September 1939, and to the villages under the Stukas, and to the couriers who did not come back, in order to measure what has actually changed and what has not. The clock, then, is reset. The scenario is scoped. The rules are declared. The armoured force is massing at dusk on the western Polish frontier, on a day in the current decade with first light as its H hour. The satellites are overhead. The sensors are watching. The question is whether the darkness of September 1st, 1939, that operational darkness in which a nation could be attacked without warning by an army it did not know had assembled, is a darkness that can still be produced. The answer begins in orbit. Before the satellites enter the story, before a single orbital pass is described or a single infrared plume characterized, the Poland that would receive the invasion has to be described as it actually exists in the current decade, because the target itself is no longer the target of 1939. That distinction is not decorative, it is structural. It changes what surprise would have to defeat before it could achieve anything at all. The Poland of September 1st, 1939 stood alone on the map, in the operational sense that mattered. It had treaties, it had guarantees, it had, on paper, the word of France and the word of Britain. What it did not have was a single foreign soldier on its soil at the moment the Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Westerplatte. It did not have integrated command arrangements with any Allied force. It did not have a shared air defence network with a neighbour. Its mobilization was its own to conduct or fail to conduct. Its intelligence was its own to gather or fail to gather. Its skies were its own to defend or lose. When the first Stukas came over Wieluń in the pre-dawn dark, they crossed a border that separated the Polish state from every other state that had promised to help it, and the border was, in every practical sense, the outer edge of Polish survival. Whatever happened inside that border happened to Poland alone until such time as Paris and London chose, at their own pace, to make it happen to them as well. History records the pace they chose. It was not the pace of rescue. The Poland of the current decade sits inside a different geometry. In March of 1999, it became a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and with that membership it entered an alliance whose founding document commits its signatories to consider an armed attack on one as an attack on all. The precise meaning of that commitment is a matter that will have to be handled with care later in this account, because it is more conditional than the popular imagination assumes and less mechanical than the phrase collective defence sometimes implies. But the membership itself is not conditional. It is a fact of standing. Poland is inside the ring. Poland is a party to the planning cycles, the exercise schedules, the intelligence sharing arrangements, the doctrine reviews, the standardization agreements that define what it means to belong to the largest and most heavily instrumented military alliance in the history of the international system. That standing does not, by itself, place a rifle in the hand of a foreign soldier on Polish ground. But since 2022, and in specific and deliberate response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine that began in February of that year, the alliance has done exactly that as well. Multinational battle groups under the framework known as Enhanced Forward Presence, which had already been established in the Baltic states and Poland in the years after the seizure of Crimea in 2014, were reinforced and extended along the alliance's entire eastern flank. American personnel are among them. British, German, French, and other Allied troops are among them. They are not tripwires in the diplomatic sense of the word, though that word has been used to describe them. They are combined arms formations, resident, exercised and integrated into the Polish National Command structure through mechanisms that did not exist in 1939 in any form and would have been incomprehensible to the Polish General Staff of that August, as it waited for word from Paris. The Polish military itself is not the force that fielded PZL-P-11 fighters and TKS tankettes against panzer divisions 85 years ago. It is a modernized force, procured and trained toward interoperability with NATO standards for a quarter century, and in recent years it has accelerated that modernization at a pace that reflects both the lessons of Ukraine and the physical proximity of the threat that produced those lessons. American Abrams main battle tanks are entering Polish service. Polish orders have been placed for the F-35 Lightning II, the American fifth-generation strike fighter. The Polish integrated air and missile defense architecture is being wired into the broader NATO air picture, drawing on ground-based radars, Allied airborne early warning aircraft, and the sensor fusion protocols that permit a track detected by one nation's radar to appear in another nation's operations centre within the timescales that modern combat demands. The Polish army of 1939 fought bravely on horseback in places where the ground and the equipment would not permit anything else. The Polish army of the current decade is a component in an alliance-wide combined arms system whose sensor and shooter chains extend beyond any single national territory. The consequence for the scenario is direct. Surprise, in September of 1939, had to defeat one army in one country whose allies were far away and whose intelligence services were, in the crucial final weeks, blind to the specifics of German concentration. Surprise, in the current decade, would have to defeat something else entirely. It would have to defeat a networked system whose sensor coverage of the invasion routes is continuous, whose forward-deployed forces are already present on the ground where the invasion would arrive, whose fighter aircraft are already airborne in the air policing rotations that have been intensified along the eastern flank since 2022, and whose command centres are already communicating with each other in the peacetime rhythm that would compress, at the first indication of mobilisation, into a wartime rhythm without the delay that shocked systems require. The 1939 Polish General Staff learned that the war had begun from telephone calls, some of which never came through because sabotage teams had cut the lines. The 2024 Polish General Staff would learn that a large-scale mobilisation was underway from the same intelligence products that would simultaneously be arriving on desks in Brussels, Mons, Ramstein, Stuttgart and Washington. The information would not travel by courier, it would travel by satellite downlink to fusion centres that exist today for precisely this purpose. That is the first change, and it is prior to any discussion of the sensors themselves. The target has been embedded, the isolation of 1939 has been dissolved by treaty, by deployment, by procurement, and by wiring. Whatever Surprise would attempt to accomplish, it would have to accomplish against a Poland that is no longer standing alone in the field. Above that Poland, the sky is not empty in the way it was empty on the night of August 30th, 1939. The night sky of that summer held only stars and the running lights of aircraft that a listener on the ground could count on the fingers of one hand. The sky above the Polish frontier in the current decade holds an active constellation of orbiting sensors whose existence and whose specific mission of watching for the movement of armies is a matter of public record maintained by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization itself. The name given to the program within NATO is the Alliance Persistent Surveillance from Space Initiative, and the constellation associated with it is known by the operational name Aquila. It became operational in 2023, with more than $1 billion committed to it by 17 allied nations acting in concert, and among those 17 nations is the United States. The word chosen for its mission is persistent, and the word carries operational weight. A single reconnaissance satellite passes over a given point on the Earth's surface and then departs from it, held to the geometry of its orbit. A persistent surveillance system is designed to close the gaps between passes by combining the coverage of multiple platforms so that the desk officer who needs to know what is happening in a particular kilometre of Silesian forest at a particular hour of a particular day can get an answer whose latency is measured in something closer to real time than to the classical revisit cycles of the Cold War. Aquila is not a single satellite. It is a network. Its specific technical parameters are not fully in the public domain, but the mission it was funded to perform is, and that mission is the tracking of exactly the kinds of physical activity that a modern Blitzkrieg would have to produce in order to exist. The kinds of physical activity are worth naming with some precision, because the argument that surprise is no longer available depends on what a mobilization of the required scale actually looks like from orbit. An army group that intends to cross an international border in a mechanized assault does not appear at the border the way a thief appears at a doorway. It arrives through a process. Fuel is moved forward, in tank cars and in truck convoys, to depots that must be established or expanded within operational range of the axis of attack. Ammunition is moved forward, in similar volumes, to similar depots. Bridging equipment is prepositioned along the routes where rivers will have to be crossed. Field hospitals are established. Command posts are set up typically in wooded ground or in requisitioned civilian structures, with the antenna arrays and vehicle parks that give them away to any imagery analyst who has seen a command post before. Rail movements intensify along specific corridors leading to the concentration areas. Combat vehicles that had been parked in garrison motor pools appear, in numbers, in staging areas that had been empty a week earlier. Fuel consumption in nearby refineries and pipeline terminals rises measurably. The electromagnetic environment thickens as radios are tested and encryption suites are activated. None of these signatures is subtle. All of them are visible in various combinations to the classes of sensor that the Aquila constellation and its allied and national counterparts operate. The 1939 concentration of 1.5 million German troops across the Polish frontier produced every one of these signatures at a scale that was in fact detectable to human observers on the ground in the border regions, and that some of them did in fact detect and report. What failed in 1939 was not the physical availability of the indicators, but the systemic ability of the intelligence and command structures to fuse them, evaluate them, and act on them within a useful timescale. The Aquila constellation and its supporting infrastructure exist to solve that specific systemic problem. Aquila does not orbit alone. Above and beside it, the United States operates through the National Reconnaissance Office, a constellation of imaging and signals, intelligence satellites whose specific numbers, orbits, and capabilities remain classified, but whose general character has been the subject of decades of public description by former officials, congressional oversight documents, and the office's own historical materials. The NRO's public history is instructive on this point. Its predecessor program of the early 1960s, Corona, was a photographic reconnaissance system whose film canisters were physically returned to Earth by parachute and caught in midair by specially modified aircraft. The Corona program produced, over the course of its operational life, more square miles of photographic intelligence than the entire preceding history of aerial reconnaissance had produced, including every mission ever flown by the U2 up to that point. The office's own summaries make that comparison explicitly. It is a useful benchmark because it defines the lower bound of what American space-based imaging capability had achieved 60 years ago with film and parachutes and physical retrieval, before digital sensors, before real-time downlink, before the advances in optics and processing that have accumulated across the intervening decades. Whatever the current NRO constellation can do, and the details of that answer sit inside compartments to which this account has no access. It does more than Corona did, at higher resolution, with lower latency, and against targets that Corona's designers could not have watched at all. It is the most capable imaging surveillance apparatus ever built by any state in the history of the technology. Set that apparatus against the specific problem of a modern mobilization. A German army group in August of 1939, or any modern equivalent that intended to reproduce its methods, cannot conceal thousands of vehicles from an imaging satellite whose ground resolution is sufficient to distinguish individual vehicles. It cannot conceal the expansion of fuel depots from a system that catalogues the appearance of new tank farms against a baseline updated on a rolling schedule. It cannot conceal the movement of bridging equipment along road networks whose ordinary traffic patterns are already characterized. It cannot conceal the establishment of forward field hospitals, whose signatures include the very specific arrangements of tents, generators, and helicopter pads that a trained analyst reads at a glance. Camouflage helps, at the tactical scale. Weather helps, on specific days and in specific bands of the electromagnetic spectrum. Movement at night helps, against optical sensors that require visible light. but the persistent surveillance concept is designed around the assumption that no single measure will defeat every sensor at every hour, and that the aggregation of coverage across time and across modalities, optical, infrared, radar, signals, closes the gaps that any single measure creates. An adversary who dispersed his forces widely enough to evade detection would defeat his own concentration. An adversary who concentrated tightly enough to attack would present a signature large enough to be seen. The relevant timescale for the seeing is not, on the argument that this account is going to make, the timescale of the border crossing itself. It is earlier. The general build-up that a large-scale invasion requires unfolds over weeks. It cannot be compressed into a single night, because the physical objects, the fuel, the ammunition, the vehicles, the bridging, the aircraft dispersal to forward fields, cannot be teleported into position. They have to be moved along ground and rail infrastructure whose throughput is finite. The window during which they are moving is the window during which the surveillance system is watching them, and the products of that watching accumulate on the desks of the analysts and the commanders who receive them long before the axis of attack is joined. In 1939, the accumulation that mattered was invisible to the systems that would have needed it. In the current decade, the accumulation is the system's ordinary output. There is a second timescale, and it is shorter. When the mobilization crosses from concentration into launch, when the vehicles start their engines in the assembly areas and begin to move forward into the attack positions, the sensor signature changes. Radios that had been silent for operational security become active because a moving column cannot coordinate itself without them. Fuel consumption in the assembly areas spikes. Air activity intensifies as strike packages assemble and depart. Infrared signatures of running engines and exhaust plumes bloom across the imagery. That transition, from concentration to launch, is the transition that a defender's warning system is designed to catch. In 1939, the transition was caught by no one. The first tactical warning was the sound of the shells landing on the Westerplatte and the sight of the bombs falling on Wielun. In the current decade, the transition would be caught by systems whose response times are measured in hours for the general force movement, and in seconds for the classes of event that the next set of sensors was built to detect. That next set of sensors is the one whose signal travels at the speed of light through a specific band of the infrared spectrum, and it is worth describing on its own terms, because the category of event it observes is distinct from anything that the imaging satellites do. A ballistic missile at the moment of ignition produces a thermal plume of extraordinary intensity. The rocket motor burns propellant at temperatures that exceed anything routinely present in the natural environment or in ordinary industrial activity, and the plume that results radiates strongly in the infrared. A sensor tuned to that specific signature, and looking down from geosynchronous orbit or from a highly elliptical orbit that dwells over particular regions of the Earth, can detect the plume within seconds of ignition, not tens of seconds, not minutes, but the small number of seconds required for the light itself to travel from the burning motor to the satellite's detector. That is the physical basis of the American space-based infrared system, known by the acronym SBIRS, which the United States has fielded across a constellation designed to provide global coverage against exactly this class of event. SBIRS is not a single satellite. It is a layered constellation. Some of its platforms sit in geosynchronous orbit, approximately 36,000 kilometers above the equator, where a single satellite can hold a hemispheric field of view continuously. Others sit in highly elliptical orbits that carry them slowly across the high latitudes of the northern hemisphere, where the geosynchronous belt cannot see well because of the geometry of the Earth. The combination provides continuous coverage of every region from which a ballistic missile could be launched, at every hour of every day, in every weather condition, because infrared plumes penetrate the cloud cover that would defeat optical imagery. When a launch occurs, the ignition event is detected by whichever platforms have line of sight to it, and the detection is characterized by cross-correlation across those platforms to determine the launch point, the initial trajectory, and the class of missile involved. The characterized track is then disseminated through the American missile warning architecture to theater commanders and to national command authorities within a chain of communications whose latency is measured in a small number of seconds from the moment of ignition. The contrast with 1939 is not a contrast of degree. It is a contrast of category. In September of 1939, a Polish garrison learned that it was under artillery fire when the shells arrived. The first indication of an incoming round was the sound of its detonation, or for the rounds that fell inside the perimeter, the flash and the concussion. There was no warning system between the launch and the impact because there could not have been one. The technology that would permit such a warning did not exist. What SPIRS does is not merely speed up the process by which a defender learns that a launch has occurred. It transforms the launch from an unobserved event, whose existence is inferred from its effects, into an observed action, whose existence is confirmed by an independent sensor before the effects can arrive. The category has changed. What was surprise has become an observation. What was inference from consequence has become measurement from cause. The defender who receives an SPIRS warning knows that a missile has been launched, knows approximately where it was launched from, knows approximately where it is going, and has the residual flight time of the missile in which to make decisions that the 1939 defender did not have any time to make at all. The residual flight time is not long on a short-range engagement, but it is not zero, and the systems that use it are the third set of components in the modern picture. When the launch is characterized as ballistic, the warning is passed to the interceptor systems that are positioned to engage it. Those systems include the ground-based interceptors that the United States operates in its homeland defense role, and they include the sea-based interceptors that the United States Navy fields aboard its Aegis-equipped Ticonderoga-class cruisers and Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. The Aegis Ballistic Missile Defense System is the specific set of software and hardware that permits an Aegis-equipped ship to receive a track from an external sensor, refine it with its own SPI radar, compute an engagement solution, and launch a standard missile interceptor against a ballistic threat in its post-boost phase. The system has been under development, testing and incremental fielding for more than 2 decades, and its combat record is no longer hypothetical. In April of 2024, over the eastern Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf, United States Navy ships equipped with Aegis ballistic missile defense engaged and intercepted ballistic missiles fired by Iranian forces in the course of an actual attempted strike against the State of Israel. The intercepts were not exercises. They were engagements against live weapons fired in anger by a state adversary, and the missiles that were intercepted did not reach their targets. The record of those engagements is a matter of public statement by American and Allied officials, and it establishes, at the empirical level that only combat can establish, that the system does what it is designed to do under the conditions in which it was designed to do it. The chain of events that begins with SPIRS detecting a plume and ends with Aegis destroying the associated warhead is, in the current decade, a demonstrated chain. It is not complete against every threat, and it is not perfect against every arsenal, and the honest reckoning with those limits will have to be part of this account before it closes. But its existence and its demonstrated function change the terms on which any modern attempt to reproduce the surprise of 1939 would have to be evaluated. The sound of the shell landing on the Westerplatte on that morning 85 years ago was the first thing the defenders heard. The plume of the missile that would land in an equivalent place in the current decade would be seen from orbit before the missile had cleared the top of its own launch tower, and the interceptor that would engage it would be receiving its cue while the missile was still climbing. The category of the event has changed. The name of the change is the transformation of surprise into observation, and the systems that produce the transformation are already, at the moment this sentence is spoken, in orbit and on watch. What remains is to describe how these systems, taken together and set against the specific problem of an army group massing on the western Polish frontier at dusk in the current decade, would perform against the specific timeline of a Blitzkrieg. The concentration would be seen for weeks. The launch would be seen in seconds. The interval between them, and what the Defenders' Alliance would do with the interval, is where the argument sharpens from a claim about sensors into a claim about warning. That claim has an hour attached to it, and the hour is 6. 6 hours is a figure that requires defense before it can be used, and the defense begins with the character of what is being watched. An army group does not appear at a frontier in a single motion. It arrives in pieces over days and weeks, from garrisons and depots and rail yards distributed across the interior of the country that intends to use it. Each of those pieces leaves a signature. Fuel is drawn from strategic reserves and moved by tanker and by pipeline toward forward staging areas, and the movement of fuel at that scale is visible to overhead imaging, both in the physical presence of the tanker columns and in the thermal footprint of the terminals where the fuel is accumulated. Ammunition is drawn from depots that have known coordinates and known baselines of activity, and the departure of ammunition trains from those depots on a schedule that departs from the ordinary produces an observable that any competent analyst is trained to flag. Armour is loaded on rail flat cars, and rail flat cars loaded with armour are a distinct object from rail. Flat cars loaded with anything else, in dimensions and in weight, and in the pattern of the loading yards where the transfer occurs. Bridging equipment, pontoon sections, engineer vehicles, mobile air defence batteries, self-propelled artillery, ammunition resupply vehicles, fuel bowsers, command tracks, electronic warfare vans, medical units, field bakeries. Each of these has a shape and a habit and a place in the order of battle, and each of them, when it's drawn out of its ordinary location and gathered with the others in an unusual place, contributes another line to a picture that grows more legible with every hour of accumulation. The picture is not read by any single sensor. It is read by the composite of what the Alliance persistent surveillance from space constellation returns, layered against the imagery produced by the National Reconnaissance Office's classified systems, layered again against signals intelligence collected against the radios and the data links of the units being observed, layered again against the reporting of ground observers and open-source imagery and commercial satellite passes that themselves have become a component of the modern intelligence ecosystem. The layering is what produces confidence. A single image can be misread. A single intercept can be a deception. A single deployment can be an exercise. The pattern of all of them, taken together and compared against the baseline of what the observed force ordinarily does in ordinary weeks, is the object that intelligence services are trained to read, and it is the object that the Alliance system in the current decade is instrumented to read continuously and in near real time. The interval between the collection of an image and its arrival on the desk of an analyst, who is authorized to act on it, has been compressed over the last generation from days to hours to, in the case of certain feeds, minutes. The interval between the analyst's conclusion and the notification of a national command authority has been compressed correspondingly. The interval between the notification and the raising of the alert posture of forward deployed forces has been compressed to the length of a secure telephone call. None of this is speculative. The infrastructure that permits it is described in the public record. The Aquila constellation was declared operational in 2023, with contributions from 17 allied nations and combined investment in excess of $1 billion, built explicitly for the purpose of tracking the movement of troops and equipment at the scale on which nation-states move them. The National Reconnaissance Office's role in providing persistent imaging of military facilities is a matter of official acknowledgement, however tightly the details of its systems remain held. The comparison that the office itself has permitted to be drawn, that its earliest generation of satellite images, the Corona program of the 1960s, returned more photographic intelligence in its operational lifetime than the entire prior era of aerial reconnaissance overflights combined, is a way of describing, in the language of the system's own history, how large the gap is between what the 1939 Defender could have known and what the 2024 Defender can be told. The gap is not incremental. The gap is categorical. Set that gap against the specific problem of a modern reproduction of full Weiss, and the 6-hour figure emerges as a floor rather than a ceiling. The concentration itself would be visible for weeks before the assault. The final movement of the assault echelons to their departure lines, the emplacement of artillery and firing positions, the forward deployment of air defence units to cover the assembly areas, the arrival of fuel and ammunition at the tactical bulk points, the loading of aircraft at forward airfields, the departure of naval units from their home ports. Every one of these steps has a signature, and every one of them is observed. Long before the 6-hour mark, the picture available to Allied intelligence would already be sufficient to describe the character of the operation, the identity of the units involved, the direction of the attack, and the probable time window of its opening. 6 hours is the figure that describes the interval between the point at which the picture becomes unambiguously operational. The point at which the units observed can no longer plausibly be described as engaged in exercise, exercise support or routine rotation, and can only be described as preparing to move, and the point at which they cross the line. 6 hours is not the warning. It is the last window before the warning becomes contact. What can be done with 6 hours by a defender who is already inside an alliance whose forward posture has been reinforced for a decade, is a very different question from what could have been done with 6 hours by the Polish General Staff of 1939, and the difference is where the pivot of the modern scenario turns. The Polish command of 1939 possessed neither the communications to distribute a warning at the speed the warning would have required, nor the forward deployed Allied forces on its own soil to receive it, nor the political framework within which a coordinated multinational response could have been assembled inside a working day. The Polish command of the current decade possesses all three. The communications are those of an integrated NATO command structure whose secure networks reach from the forward battle groups on the Polish frontier to the operations centres of the alliance's headquarters and to the situation rooms of the capitals of every member state. The forward-deployed Allied forces are those of the Enhanced Forward Presence battle groups established in the wake of 2014 and reinforced after 2022, whose composition includes American, British, German, French, and other national contingents present on Polish soil as a matter of ordinary rotation. The political framework is that of the North Atlantic Treaty itself, and the working relationships between the political leadership of the alliance's members that have been rehearsed, in real crises and in exercised ones, across a generation of common membership. Set that combination against a warning of 6 hours, and the actions that would follow it are describable in specific terms. The Polish armed forces would move to their higher state of operational readiness, a movement that in the current decade means the manning of prepared positions along the eastern and western frontiers, the dispersion of aircraft from their peacetime bases to their wartime dispersal fields, the activation of air defense radars from standby to full operation, and the confirmation of the chain of command from the President and the Minister of National Defense down to the battalion level. The enhanced forward presence battle groups on Polish soil would move to their own readiness postures, which for the American, British and German contingents in particular means the manning of their armoured vehicles, the deployment of their integrated air defence assets to their firing positions, and the establishment of the communications links that connect them to their respective national command authorities, as well as to the NATO command structure. The air policing mission that the alliance has maintained continuously over its eastern flank since the accession of the Central European members would move from its ordinary posture, a small number of fighters on quick reaction alert, ready to launch on a scramble order, to a surged posture, with additional aircraft airborne, additional aircraft on immediate alert, an additional tanker and airborne early warning aircraft, providing the sustainment that a sustained air operation would require. The airspace over Poland would fill, in the 6 hours before the crossing, with the aircraft that in the 1939 scenario were nowhere to be found until it was already too late. The naval component of the response would occupy the Baltic. United States Navy Aegis-equipped destroyers and cruisers, forward deployed to European waters as a matter of standing policy since the reinforcement of the alliance's posture after 2022, would move to positions from which the Aegis ballistic missile defense systems engagement geometry against launches, originating from the territory of the aggressor, is optimized. The specific ship classes are known. The Ticonderoga-class cruiser and the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer are the two hulls that carry the system, and the missiles that they employ against ballistic threats are variants of the standard missile family, cued by Assassi series radars, integrated through the Aegis combat system's command and decision element. The ships that would occupy those stations are not hypothetical. They are the ships whose deployment schedules are, in ordinary weeks, a matter of routine reporting in the naval press, and whose presence in European waters as an element of the alliance's standing forward posture is not a wartime measure, but a peacetime one that would be reinforced, in the crisis, by the movement of additional hulls from other stations. Above the political level, the heads of state of the alliance's members would already be in communication. The secure conference calls that the White House Situation Room, the Élysée, Number 10 Downing Street, the Chancellery in Berlin, and the corresponding facilities in the other capitals maintain as a matter of continuous readiness would be active. The North Atlantic Council would be assembled in emergency session at the alliance's headquarters in Brussels. The specific procedures by which the Council conducts an emergency session are documented, and the participants are the permanent representatives of the member states, each of whom is authorized to speak for his or her government at the diplomatic level while the political leaders themselves consult in parallel. What the Council would say in that session is the question on which the honest speculation must slow down and become careful. because here is where the popular imagination and the actual language of the treaty diverge, and where the discipline of the thought experiment requires that the divergence be named plainly rather than smoothed over. The popular imagination holds that an attack on any NATO member automatically obligates the other 31 members to declare war, deploy forces, and enter combat in defense of the attacked party. That is not what the treaty says. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, in the language that has stood since 1949, obligates the parties to treat an armed attack against one as an armed attack against all, and to assist the party so attacked by taking, individually and in concert with the other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. The operative phrase is such action as it deems necessary. Each member determines for itself what action Article 5 requires it to take in the specific circumstances of the specific attack. The commitment is political, and it is real, and it has been, for more than 7 decades, one of the most durable security guarantees in the international system. But it is not automatic in the mechanical sense that the popular version of it implies. It is a promise to do what each member judges must be done, not a switch that, when thrown, delivers a pre-programmed military response. That distinction is not a technicality, and it is not an exercise in legal fine print. It is the distinction that has been demonstrated, most recently and most publicly, in the incident that occurred in September of 2025, when 19 Russian drones crossed into Polish airspace during operations associated with the war in Ukraine and were engaged over Polish territory. The Polish government, faced with the question of which article of the treaty to invoke in response, invoked Article 4, which obligates consultation among the members whenever, in the opinion of any of them, the territorial integrity, political independence, or security of any of the parties is threatened. It did not invoke Article 5. That choice was analysed at the time, in detail, by the Belfer Center at Harvard's Kennedy School and by the Atlantic Council in Washington, and their analyses, cross-verified against each other and against the public statements of Polish officials, converged on the reading that the Polish government's choice reflected a calculated preference for a graduated response over an escalatory one. The airspace violation was serious. It was not, in the judgment of the government that had suffered it, an attack of the character that required the invocation of the treaty's collective defence clause. Article 4 was invoked, consultation occurred, and the crisis was managed without the alliance being obligated to organise a coordinated military response. The lesson that the September 2025 episode carries into the modern scenario is not that Article 5 is empty. It is that Article 5 is a document of political judgment, and that political judgment takes time, and that the character of the attack, the identity of the attacker, and the range of responses under consideration are all factors that would shape the specific action that the alliance's members would take in the 6 hours between the warning and the crossing, and in the hours and days that would follow. A full-scale conventional invasion of a NATO member by a peer adversary is a different case from a 19-drone airspace violation, and it is reasonable to expect that the alliance's response would be correspondingly different. But the difference cannot be assumed to be automatic. The response would be constructed in real time by 32 national governments, consulting through the mechanisms that the treaty and the alliance have built for the purpose. The construction would be faster than it would have been in 1939, because the mechanisms exist and because the working relationships are in place. It would not be instantaneous. Serious speculation about the modern scenario has to hold the difference between faster and instantaneous as a real difference, and it has to hold the difference between political commitment and automatic military trigger as a real difference, because the credibility of any claim about what would happen in the modern scenario depends on those differences being respected. What can be claimed with high confidence, then, is a specific and narrower proposition. It is not the proposition that a modern reproduction of Fall Weiss would be defeated by the automatic deployment of a unified NATO army against the aggressor within the first hours of the attack. That claim overreaches the treaty, and it overreaches the record. It is the proposition that the element on which the 1939 operation depended for its success, the element of total operational surprise, the exploitation of an intelligence blindness on the part of the defender that permitted the aggressor's concentration and initial movement to go undetected until contact was made. That element, in the current decade, is not available. It cannot be manufactured, It cannot be preserved through deception. It cannot be produced by the combination of measures that produced it in August of 1939. The Glavitz staging that provided the pretext, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that provided the strategic cover, the sabotage of Polish communications that provided the tactical isolation, and above all the absence of any Allied capability to observe the German concentration in the weeks before the crossing, that combination of conditions no longer exists in a form that could produce the same effect. The concentration would be observed, the launch would be detected, the warning would be delivered, the defender would be at battle stations, and the Aegis-equipped ships that would be positioned in the Baltic to engage any ballistic threats emerging from the aggressor's territory would be the same ships whose combat record, as of April of 2024, is the empirical answer to any question about whether the Aegis ballistic missile defense system actually works against actual missiles fired by actual adversaries in actual combat. That record deserves to be named in its specifics because it is the most concrete piece of evidence available to the modern scenario, and it is the evidence that separates the argument from the category of Pentagon procurement brochure and places it in the category of demonstrated capability. The engagement occurred on the night of the 13th and the morning of the 14th of April 2024. The Iranian government, in retaliation for a preceding Israeli strike on Iranian personnel in Damascus, launched a large combined strike against Israel that included ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and one-way attack drones. The strike was the first time that Iran had directly attacked Israeli territory from Iranian territory, and its scale, several hundred munitions in the aggregate, made it one of the largest single ballistic missile attacks of the modern era. Israel's own air and missile defense systems, including the Arrow interceptors designed for the exo-atmospheric engagement of long-range ballistic threats, engaged the incoming missiles. So did the American forces positioned in the region for exactly this contingency. Among those American forces were United States Navy Arleigh Burke-class destroyers operating in the eastern Mediterranean. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyer USS Arleigh Burke, the lead ship of the class from which the class takes its name, and the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer USS Carney were among the ships that engaged ballistic missiles in the course of the Iranian strike. Each ship carries the Aegis combat system, and the version of that system installed aboard them incorporates the Aegis ballistic missile defense capability that permits the engagement of ballistic threats in their post-boost phase using the standard missile family of interceptors. The engagement was not, as had been the case in every prior public discussion of Aegis ballistic missile defense, a test range event or a simulation. It was combat. The missiles that the ships engaged were live weapons launched by a state adversary in the course of an actual attack. The standard missile interceptors that the ships fired were fired at those missiles under fire control solutions, computed in real time against tracks generated by the ship's own SPY radars and by the external cueing that arrived through the same architecture that would cue them in the Baltic scenario. The space-based infrared system detected the thermal signatures of the Iranian launches within seconds of ignition, as it is designed to do, and the tracks that its detection initiated were passed through the missile defense integration architecture to the engaging ships. The chain that the previous account described in the abstract, Espers to Aegis to standard missile to intercept, operated on the night in question in reality. The intercept succeeded. The missiles that the Aegis-equipped ships engaged did not reach their intended targets. The significance of that engagement for the argument of the modern Polish scenario is that it moved the Aegis ballistic missile defense system out of the category of systems whose performance is known only from testing and into the category of systems whose performance is known from combat. There is a difference between the two categories, and defense analysts have always been careful about the difference. Testing environments, however rigorous, are known environments. The parameters are set by the testers. The threat missile is a target of known trajectory and known characteristics. The engagement geometry is chosen in advance. The countermeasures, when they are present, are the countermeasures that the testers have decided to include. A combat engagement is none of those things. The threat is chosen by the enemy. The trajectory is what the enemy computes. The characteristics of the incoming missile, its mass, its terminal maneuver, its warhead configuration, the presence or absence of penetration aids, are known, if at all, only to the extent that intelligence about the enemy's arsenal has been able to reconstruct them. And the engagement occurs at whatever moment the enemy chooses, in whatever geometry the enemy chooses, under whatever conditions the enemy has been able to arrange. That an Aegis-equipped destroyer, operating in the eastern Mediterranean on the night of April 13th, was able to intercept a live Iranian ballistic missile fired in the course of an actual state-on-state attack is a data point that no test range can produce and no procurement briefing can substitute for. It is the data point that the system was designed, over more than 2 decades of development, to be able to produce, and it is the data point that the system produced. That data point does not close every question. It answers the question of whether the system works against the specific class of threats it engaged, in the specific engagement conditions in which it engaged them. It does not answer, and cannot answer, the question of whether the system would work against every ballistic threat that any adversary might fire under any conditions. That's a larger question, and the honest reckoning with it is the part of the argument that the modern scenario has not yet reached. There are limits, acknowledged in the American government's own doctrinal documents, on what the American missile defense architecture is designed to accomplish. Those limits are not a footnote to the argument. They are a structural feature of it, and they will have to be examined on their own terms before the modern scenario can be closed. But before that examination proceeds, the shape of what has been established has to be held clearly. The 1939 attack succeeded because the defender could not see. The 2024 attack, if it were attempted, would meet a defender who could see for weeks, who would be warned for hours, whose forward-deployed Allied forces would be at battle stations before the first shot, whose air-policing fighters would be airborne, whose Aegis-equipped ships would be in the Baltic at missile defense readiness, and whose alliance would be in emergency political consultation from the moment the warning was distributed. Whether that alliance would resolve to enter the fight, and how quickly, and under what conditions, are questions that Article 5 does not answer automatically, and that the political leaders of the alliance's members would have to answer in real time. But the surprise on which the 1939 operation depended is not among the resources that the 2024 attacker would have to work with. That resource has been taken off the table by the systems that watch, and it cannot be put back. The remaining question, before the account can turn to what happens after the first shots are fired, and to the acknowledged limits of the systems that would be firing back, is the question of what a modern attacker, deprived of surprise but not deprived of mass, might still be able to accomplish against the defences that would be waiting for him. That question has an unpleasant answer, and the unpleasantness of the answer is the reason the doctrinal documents of the country that operates the most capable of the defensive systems admit, in language chosen with care and repeated in successive reviews, that there are threats against which those systems are neither intended nor able to prevail. The admission is public, it is on the record, and it is the necessary next component of any account of the modern scenario that intends to be honest about the ceiling of the capabilities it has been describing. The document in question is the 2022 Missile Defense Review, published by the United States Department of Defense in the autumn of that year, and its language on this point is not evasive and not buried. It states, in a formulation repeated across successive American strategic documents, that the ground-based mid-course defense system, the architecture of interceptors based in Alaska and California, that constitutes the American homeland's dedicated defense against intercontinental ballistic missile attack, is neither intended nor capable of defeating a large-scale ballistic missile assault from a peer adversary such as the Russian Federation or the People's Republic of China. The words are precise, and they were chosen. They are not a hedge inserted by a skeptical analyst. They are the official position of the government that operates the system, articulated in a document whose purpose is to establish for the record what the system is and is not being purchased to accomplish. And they mean, in plain terms, that the American missile defense architecture has been designed around a class of threat that does not include the arsenals of the world's 2 other major nuclear powers. The threats it has been designed to defeat are smaller. They are the arsenals of states whose ballistic missile inventories are counted in dozens, or in some cases in hundreds, not in thousands. They are the arsenals of adversaries whose warheads are not accompanied by sophisticated decoys and penetration aids of the kind that the largest arsenals have been engineered to deploy, and they are engagement scenarios in which the number of incoming objects is small enough that a defensive system with a finite number of interceptors and a finite number of engagement opportunities can plausibly be expected to run the intercept math and prevail. Against a peer arsenal, the math is different. The number of warheads is larger by orders of magnitude. the sophistication of the accompanying countermeasures is higher. The number of interceptors required to attempt a defense against every incoming warhead exceeds the number of interceptors that exist, and the American government, in its own official reckoning of what its own defensive system can accomplish, has declined to claim otherwise. This is unusual. Governments do not, as a rule, publicly disclose the ceilings of their military capabilities. Governments prefer, in most cases, to allow adversaries to overestimate what those capabilities can accomplish, because overestimation contributes to deterrence and underestimation invites adventurism. The decision to state the limits of the Homeland Missile Defense System in plain public language reflects a strategic calculation of a different kind. It reflects the calculation that the credibility of the American nuclear deterrent, the promise that any large-scale attack on the American homeland would be answered by an American nuclear response of catastrophic magnitude, depends on the adversary understanding clearly that the American homeland is not shielded, that a peer-level attack would not be caught and neutralized by defensive interceptors, and that the response to such an attack would therefore have to come from the offensive nuclear forces that constitute the actual deterrent. The public admission of the ceiling is, in that sense, itself a piece of strategic doctrine. It is designed to keep the adversary honest about what would happen if the adversary chose to strike. None of that changes when the scenario in question is not a nuclear exchange, but a conventional invasion of a NATO member state on the alliance's eastern flank. But it does establish a frame that the modern scenario cannot ignore. The Aegis system that intercepted Iranian ballistic missiles in April of 2024 is a naval system, deployed on ships, designed for engagement of threats in specific classes and specific engagement envelopes. It is a component of the American and Allied missile defense architecture, and a highly effective component within its designed envelope. But it is not the same system as the ground-based mid-course defense architecture that protects the American homeland, and neither system, alone or in combination with the other, has been designed against or is claimed to be capable of defeating the full weight of a peer adversary's ballistic missile arsenal. The Russian arsenal is not the Iranian arsenal. The gap between them is not a matter of degree, it is a matter of category. Iran's ballistic force is measured in the hundreds of missiles across all ranges combined, of varying sophistication, and it was against a small subset of that force, fired at long range and tracked in real time by American and Allied sensors, that the Aegis intercepts of April 2024 were achieved. The Russian strategic arsenal comprises well over 1,000 deployed nuclear warheads across an integrated triad of land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and air-delivered weapons, along with a large inventory of shorter-range systems that includes the theatre-range ballistic missiles most directly relevant to any scenario involving a land war on NATO's eastern border. Against that inventory, no defensive architecture in existence claims comprehensive coverage. The American government does not claim it. The alliance does not claim it. The claim is not made because the claim would not be true, and the officials who write the doctrinal documents have chosen, at considerable cost to what might otherwise be a more reassuring public message, to keep the record straight. The implication for the modern scenario is not that the surveillance advantage collapses. The surveillance advantage is a separate axis. Watching an attack coming and stopping every warhead that is incoming are, as the frame of this account has insisted throughout, different problems, and the fact that the second problem cannot be fully solved does not diminish the fact that the first problem largely has been. The defender, who is warned, still fights a different war than the defender who is blind, even when the war that follows the warning is a war in which the defender takes damage. What the acknowledged ceiling does is refuse the temptation to convert the surveillance argument into a claim of comprehensive American invulnerability. That claim would be false, and its falseness is documented in the country's own strategic reviews. The honest formulation is narrower and more useful. The honest formulation is that the specific mechanism by which the 1939 campaign achieved its result, the operational blindness of the defender, the ability of the attacker to concentrate mass in secret and to arrive at the border with the defender's command structure unwarned and unprepared, is not available to a modern attacker on NATO's eastern flank. That specific mechanism has been closed. Other mechanisms have not been closed, and some of them are formidable, and the doctrinal documents that govern the defensive systems in question are careful to say so. Held in that frame, the shape of the modern scenario becomes clearer than it would be under either the triumphalist reading or the dismissive one. The triumphalist reading would hold that the systems in place would defeat any attack against a NATO member state cleanly and at low cost. The dismissive reading would hold that, because those systems have limits, the surveillance advantages that have been described do not really matter, and the outcome would resemble 1939 more than it would differ from it. Neither reading survives contact with the actual capabilities and the actual limits as they are documented. The systems are real, their combat performance is real, and their limits are real, and the scenario has to be assessed with all three held in view simultaneously. That assessment, at the level of the strategic decision that a hypothetical attacker would face on the eve of ordering an operation of this kind, produces a picture that bears almost no resemblance to the picture that faced the German General Staff in the last week of August 1939. On that occasion, the attacker was operating in a condition of near total informational asymmetry in his favour. He knew his own dispositions in detail. He knew, from cryptographic and diplomatic sources and from the visible political disarray of the Polish and Allied response to the previous month's provocations, a great deal about the defender's condition and intentions, and he had every reason to believe, and did believe, that the defender knew almost nothing about his own dispositions, and would learn what he needed to know only when the panzers crossed the border and the Stukas began their dives. The concentration of force at the border had been achieved without triggering a Polish general mobilization. The operational plan had been distributed to the field commands without leaking to Warsaw. The date and hour of the attack were known in Berlin and in the assault echelons and nowhere else. On that basis, the attack was ordered. On that basis, the tactical surprise that the doctrine required was in fact achieved, and on that basis the campaign unfolded in the manner that its designers had projected, and that the Polish defenders were structurally unable to arrest. A hypothetical attacker facing the modern configuration on NATO's eastern flank would face a decision defined by the opposite condition. He would know that his mobilization had been under continuous overhead observation for as long as the mobilization had been proceeding. He would know that the tracks of his armoured units, the fuel consumption of his logistics tail, the electromagnetic activity of his command posts, and the thermal signatures of his forward staging areas had been catalogued in near real time by the persistent surveillance constellation that the Alliance began fielding in 2023, and by the classified imaging systems that supplement it. He would know that the alert states of the American Aegis-equipped ships in and around the Baltic had been raised in response to what he was doing. He would know that fighter aircraft from multiple Allied air forces were flying enhanced air policing patterns along the border his forces were preparing to cross. He would know that the political leaderships of the Alliance's member states had been in consultation regarding his movements for days or weeks, and he would know, because the information environment in which modern military and political decisions are made makes such things nearly impossible to conceal, that the defender's national command authority in the country he was preparing to invade had ordered general mobilization, had activated its own missile defense integration with the Alliance's shared systems, and had assumed a war footing that the Polish command of 1939 was never permitted, by the diplomatic pressures of that late August, to assume. That is a fundamentally different starting condition for the ordering of an attack, and it produces a fundamentally different set of expectations about what the attack could accomplish in its opening phase. The historical analogies for the removal of surprise from an operational plan are unforgiving. At midway in June of 1942, the Japanese carrier force approached what it believed was a strategically unprepared American position, and encountered instead an American carrier force that had been positioned in advance on the basis of signals intelligence that had partially reconstructed the Japanese plan of attack. The Japanese operational assumption was that the target of the attack was unaware and undefended. The operational reality was that the target of the attack was informed and waiting. The tactical consequences of that inversion determined the outcome of the engagement and, through the outcome of the engagement, contributed to the strategic trajectory of the entire Pacific War. In Normandy, in June of 1944, the reverse dynamic held. The Allied landings succeeded, at the cost that they did succeed, in significant part because the German High Command was unable to determine, in the days and hours leading up to the landings and in the first hours after they had begun, whether the landings in Normandy were the main effort or a diversion in advance of a larger operation elsewhere. The Allied deception operation had induced in the German command a condition of operational uncertainty that translated directly into a hesitation to commit the mobile reserves that might have contested the beachhead effectively. Surprise, in both cases, was not a preference of the doctrine that employed it. It was structural. It was the resource without which the operational plan could not deliver the results that its designers had projected, and when it was denied, whether by cryptography or by deception, or by any of the other mechanisms by which surprise can be stripped from an operation, the operational plan did not merely underperform, it failed to produce the effects on which its subsequent phases had been designed to build. Blitzkrieg belongs to that same category of doctrine. Its speed, its concentration, its exploitation of the defender's collapse of command and control at the operational level, its ability to bypass strongpoints and encircle formations that had not been given the time to redeploy. None of these effects were available to the doctrine's practitioners in the absence of the initial tactical surprise that produced the collapse. The doctrine was not a general-purpose method for achieving decision in land warfare. It was a specific method that required a specific input, and the input was the informational blindness of the defender in the opening hours of the campaign. In 1939, that input was available. In 1940, it was available again, and produced the collapse of France. In 1941, in the opening phase of the invasion of the Soviet Union, it was available on a still larger scale, and produced the encirclements at Białystok and Minsk and Smolensk and Kiev that consumed the Red Army of the border districts in the first months of that campaign. And in each of those cases, the doctrine's success rested on the same load-bearing element. When that element was later denied, by the accumulation of Soviet reconnaissance capacity, and by the exhaustion of German offensive momentum, the doctrine ceased to produce the same results. It became, in its later applications, an increasingly costly attempt to reproduce effects that its structural preconditions could no longer support. To transplant the 1939 attack into 2024 without transplanting also the informational conditions that made it work is therefore not to reproduce the 1939 attack. It is to attempt an operation whose designers never intended it to be attempted under those conditions, and whose foundational assumption has been removed before the operation begins. What the attacker would still possess is mass. The tanks are real, the aircraft are real, the artillery is real, the logistical tail is real. What the attacker would not possess is the surprise, and in the absence of surprise the tanks would advance into airspace whose control was already contested by Allied air forces at readiness, against a defender whose command structure had received warning hours before the crossing, into engagement zones whose coordinates were known to Aegis-equipped ships that had been positioned in advance to engage the ballistic threats those tanks would depend on for the suppression of Allied airfields and logistics, and toward a political outcome that the attacker could not predict, because the political consultations that would determine whether Article 5 was invoked, and how quickly and to what effect, would be occurring in real time in response to actions the attacker had not yet completed. The plan of 1939 was ordered on the confidence that the defender would not know what was coming until it had already arrived. The plan of 2024, if such a plan were ordered, would be ordered in the certainty that the defender already knew. That is the strategic transformation. It is not the transformation of every element of the military problem. It is not the abolition of the possibility of war on NATO's eastern flank. It is not a guarantee that a war so initiated would proceed to any particular outcome, or that the defences that would engage it would engage every threat successfully, or that the acknowledged ceilings on the American missile defence architecture would not be reached and passed in the course of it. It is the transformation of one specific variable, the variable of operational surprise, from a resource available to the attacker into a resource unavailable to the attacker. That variable was the load-bearing wall of the doctrine that made September 1st, 1939, what it was. Its removal does not by itself win a future war. Its removal changes the terms on which such a war would have to be fought, and it changes them in ways that the attacker would have to account for in the decision to fight at all. The account returns then to the morning it began with. Before dawn on September 1st, 1939, in the border villages of western Poland, roosters called and the smell of wood smoke rose from cottage chimneys, and farmers rose to walk out to their fields as they had risen the morning before and the morning before that. The Schleswig-Holstein opened fire at 4:43 in the harbour at Danzig. 62 German divisions and more than 1,300 aircraft crossed the border in the coordinated assault that the doctrine had designed. The Luftwaffe destroyed the Polish Air Force within days, and left the Polish army under the panzer divisions without cover overhead. By October 2nd, organised Polish resistance had ceased, and by the time the war that had begun that morning had ended, 6 years later, Poland had lost between 5 and 6 million citizens, roughly 2.7 to 3 million Polish Jews murdered in the Holocaust, and roughly 1.8 to 2 million non-Jewish Polish civilians killed by the occupying powers of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in the years between, along with several 100,000 deaths among the soldiers and resistance fighters who had fought in the campaign of 1939 and in the campaigns that followed it. The scale of the catastrophe was not solely the product of the surprise that opened it. The surprise did not cause the Holocaust. The Holocaust was caused by the ideology and the machinery of the regime that carried it out. But the surprise made possible the speed of the initial conquest that placed the Polish population within a reach of that regime, and the speed of that initial conquest was inseparable from the operational darkness in which the Polish command was left in the days before and the hours after the attack began. The satellites do not reach back to those people. The systems that have been described, the persistent surveillance constellation operational since 2023, the space-based infrared warning architecture that detects a missile launch within seconds of ignition, the classified imaging satellites that provide continuous coverage of military facilities and troop movements, the naval missile defense that demonstrated in April of 2024 that it can intercept a ballistic missile fired in state-on-state combat. None of them exist in the world of September 1st, 1939. They exist in the world of 2024, and their existence changes the strategic problem of an attack on Poland from the problem it was in 1939 into a different problem. But they do not retroactively reach the border villages of 85 years ago, and they do not close the questions that the acknowledged limits of the defensive architectures leave open about what a future war on NATO's eastern flank would actually cost, even to a defender who was warned. The 2022 Missile Defense Review's language on the ceiling of the Homeland Defense System against a peer adversary's arsenal is not a rhetorical concession. It is a statement about the physical world. A war on the eastern flank of NATO in the present would not be a bloodless demonstration of the surveillance advantage. It would be a war, and the acknowledged ceilings would be reached, and the human cost would be real. What the surveillance infrastructure of the present has structurally ended for NATO's eastern flank is the specific condition of the defender's operational blindness that made the specific morning of September 1st, 1939 what it was. It has ended the availability of that condition to any attacker who would seek to reproduce that morning against a NATO member state today. The tanks can be built, and the aircraft can be built, and the shells can be stockpiled, and the divisions can be raised, and none of those preparations can now be conducted in the informational darkness that concealed them then. That is the distinction the thought experiment has been reaching for. It is not a claim of American or Allied invulnerability. It is a claim about one variable, the variable that in 1939 was decisive, and about the systems that in 2024 have removed it from the resources available to any adversary who would try that campaign again. Those systems were built for a reason. The reason is the memory of what happened when the defender could not see, and the memory is still there, in the border villages, in the roosters, and the wood smoke of a morning that came before the first shells, and that the people who heard those shells did not survive to describe. The satellites have been watching from the day they were launched, so that no such morning will begin again in silence over that ground. Whether that is enough is a question the world has not been asked to answer. The systems and the doctrines and the acknowledged limits all exist so that it will not have to be.